Well, Corona is on the way out, and all the newer, upgraded crises are on the way in. And we know this not just from the I got my vaccine social media avatars shifting to Ukrainian flag avatars, not just from the mandates suddenly falling like dominoes, even in the bluest parts of the national landscape, in perfectly timed preparation for the State of the Union address and the midterm campaigns. I'm making this video on Tuesday before the speech, so who knows? Perhaps we'll get some sort of formal declaration of victory from the hardly coherent authority on the matter. But mostly you can tell from the fact that it's suddenly okay to joke about it now. Here's a skit from Saturday Night Live last weekend, the punchline being, yeah, we all kind of knew this was bullshit, but we still didn't let each other talk about it anyway.
It's like COVID's not over, but it's just gonna stop? I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah. You know, that reminds me of this article I read.
Oh, honey, no one wants to hear about that.
What article? It was just saying how mask mandates had, I don't know, little to no effect on COVID.
See, it's funny because we all knew it was nonsense, but we still forced people out of their jobs anyway. We all knew it was nonsense, but we still stunted the academic and social development of our children for 2 years. We all knew it was nonsense, but we still wrecked our entire economy and spiked deaths of despair to indulge it. Hilarious. The punchline is we are all anxious, neurotic idiots who overreacted to a minor threat, and they're just going to pretend they had nothing to do with enforcing that neurotic overreaction on everybody else. So apparently the villainy of the last 2 years will just be punctuated with a chuckle and a shrug. Whoopsie. Oh well, what are you going to do? And we're all supposed to just carry on as though all of this was somehow unavoidable. As though rational minds haven't been screaming about the avoidability for 2 full years now and smeared as conspiracy theorists and racists and grandma killers for their efforts. What we're going to do is not that ever again. Our response to the virus has been one of the greatest policy blunders in recent decades, if you believe in our leadership's simple incompetence. One of the greatest abuses, if you believe in their malice. Even if all of this was simple multi-year mistake, you don't walk away from your mistakes without learning lessons. A drunk doesn't walk away from a car crash laughing, saying, oh well, what can you do? You can evaluate how your choices and behaviors produce this disastrous outcome and make better choices and behaviors in the future. So we can't just sweep under the rug. We can't just carry on. We have to know all there is to know about how all of this developed as matters of both fact and policy, and accountability must be achieved. Though, of course, these days, the list of accountability pending is much, much longer than the list of accountability applied. And so you'll notice key facts just swept under the rug as we move on to the next one. On Saturday, I saw a bold headline in the New York Times that cut against the prevailing wisdom that's developed over the last year plus. The wet market origin theory for the virus is officially back on. Yes, you may have thought that bat soup idea was nonsense and all but dead, but new research points back to the Wuhan market as the pandemic origin. New research funded by Fauci's NIH, by the way, the National Institutes of Health, the embattled federal agency with a direct interest in countering accusations they themselves funded old research that created the virus itself. And new research, as it applies to this analysis, is something of a generous term, both because the data points included in the analysis aren't actually new, but also because the research isn't as rigorous or as thorough as those otherwise so committed to the science usually insist. It's 2 new reports that sure haven't been published in a scientific journal requiring peer review yet, but they are 150 cumulative pages, which tells us nothing. You can have a brief haiku of bullshit. You can have a War and Peace brick of bullshit. The quantity does not change the content, and the content has not been evaluated for its quality, at least not thoroughly. These reports are posted on Zenodo, something like the Facebook or Reddit of research papers. Anybody can post anything. And anybody's anything is published immediately. Now, of course, that doesn't mean the reports are wrong. Einstein could post to this site just the same as some rando claiming completely made-up data and credentials could. It's just notable that the people insisting that we all submit to the undeniable rigor of the science are suddenly loose with the rigor just because they like the conclusions. I am not aware of the New York Times publishing glowing endorsements of other unreviewed, unpublished material really ever. But let's be thorough and consider what these reports say. The reports are based on genetic analysis of virus samples collected from the Wuhan market in December 2019 and January 2020, specifically very precise location data for where these early samples were collected. The researchers note that a concentration of the samples exists in a particular section of the market where live animals were sold. So what though? That's just proximity, as in something happened next to something else. It's hard to attribute causality on that basis. If there's a crime at my neighbor's house, it doesn't necessarily mean that I had something to do with it. So what else points to animal origin at the market? Well, the researchers have two original virus lineages that were both present at the market. And they're too different from each other for one to have evolved so quickly from the other in humans. Therefore, these researchers believe there must be animal origin because these two forms of the virus spread to humans separately. Okay, but these researchers still have a lot of problems here, both in their own methods and evidence and in what their theory doesn't address about the lab leak origin theory. On their own evidence and methods, the biggest hole in this analysis is no actual demonstration of what animal or animals the virus supposedly came from. There is no definitive evidence presented. The authors speculate it might be raccoon dogs, again, due to proximity in the market and these animals carrying other types of coronaviruses before. They tell you it was an animal, but they can't tell you what animal, not just specifically what individual animal, they can't even tell you what species. And they reach this conclusion based largely on proximity, but that's another problem with this analysis, how that proximity is demonstrated and measured. The report includes a heat map showing concentrations of positive virus samples in this particular western portion of the market, but that concentration assumes that all areas of the market were sampled equally. If you sample one area more frequently than others, you will likely find more positives in that area. And it appears that's what's happened here. If I dig for worms in one particular area of my lawn and I find a whole bunch of them, it doesn't necessarily mean there are way more worms in that spot than others. It just means I didn't dig in the rest of my lawn to find out. And the other side of the problems here is what this analysis doesn't defeat about the lab leak theory or other explanations. Firstly, if proximity is a major piece of the evidence, it applies just as strongly to the lab. The lab is just a hop across the river from the market. The Chinese CDC is even closer than that, but weirdly, these sites are not marked on the New York Times mapping. Secondly, circumstance 2 is just as strong of a case for the lab leak theory. It doesn't make sense to say that these raccoon dogs are known to carry coronaviruses, so that's conclusive, while ignoring an immediately nearby lab that is known to work with them, and not just coronaviruses in general, but specifically the most genetically similar relative to this virus that we know of, sharing a 97% genetic match. And to buy this undying wet market theory, you have to ignore evidence of viral presence well before these samples were ever taken. Remember, those earliest wet market samples in this analysis are from December 2019. But U.S. intelligence says Wuhan lab employees were hospitalized with COVID-19-like symptoms before that in November. And even if you think that's mistaken diagnosis and not in fact corona, there's plenty of other evidence to believe the virus existed well before these wet market samples. Italian officials say it existed there in September 2019, discovered in blood cancer screenings. Spanish officials say far earlier than that even, claiming viral traces were found in a March 2019 sewer sample. It is just not the case that these Wuhan raccoon dogs were the first known appearance of the virus. It was in a lot of places well before those samples were taken. The information supposedly supporting this wet market origin theory is old, and it's countered by other facts that are also old, and yet it's being revived and emphasized as something new, and how we're supposed to remember corona as it fades away. Meanwhile, there actually is very significant new information that's simultaneously ignored, and that's the real lesson here. If you're wondering why I spent so much time on old info, well, This is why the old info led me to the new info that I otherwise heard nothing about. The Washington Examiner reported on these new wet market origin reports, and at the bottom of their story, I noticed something significant. It's still possible that the virus originated from the lab, according to the Moderna CEO. Why? Well, in addition to the evidence that we just reviewed, last week, scientists found a tiny chunk of DNA in the virus that matches a sequence patented by Moderna 3 years before the pandemic began in 2016. I'm sorry, what? It seems like we've really buried the lead here, but buried is still better than absent. And yeah, that claim checks out. The Daily Mail reports a team of virologists published a study in Frontiers of Virology on February 21st, in which they compared COVID's makeup to millions of sequenced proteins in an online database. And wow, the original COVID genome shares a sequence of 19 specific letters with a genetic section owned by Moderna, something Moderna patented in 2016 as part of their cancer research division. Now, of course, we are talking about a very small sequence of those building blocks, 19 of them out of 30,000 total in the sequence for coronavirus, 3,300 total in the Moderna patented sequence, but still, the odds of that chain being replicated naturally or coincidentally, according to these researchers, is 1 in 3 trillion. Other scientists dispute the calculation of that probability. They say the likelihood is somewhat higher, but no matter how you calculate it, we're still talking lottery level luck. And it's not just the statistical probability of that gene sequence match happening in general. It is also the circumstantial probability of that match happening with somebody so closely related to the issue. What are the odds that a company that had prior development with that particular gene sequence just so happens to be in position to profit historically from it just a few years later? That is winning the lottery twice. And if it is such an outrageous, nonsensical, conspiratorial thing to notice and to talk about, you would think that Moderna would flatly deny any funny business, but they don't. As part of that interview with Fox Business last week, the CEO leaves it totally open. Yeah, I guess anything is possible. We're looking into it.
The Daily Mail is reporting, it says more evidence COVID was tinkered with in a lab. Now scientists find the virus contains a tiny chunk of DNA that matches sequence patented by Moderna 3 years before the pandemic began. Your reaction, Stefan?
My scientists are looking into those data to see how accurate they are or not. As I've said before, the hypothesis of an escape from a lab by an accident is possible. Human makes mistakes.
Humans make mistakes. Well, on that, I guess we can agree. If only we'd remember that wisdom before we surrender so much power to centralized humans to impose their mistakes on the rest of us. But let's recap the evidence, the coincidences that count and the coincidences that don't. It is just coincidence that the Wuhan lab happens to work on this exact type of virus, and specifically the closest known relative to it. It is also just coincidence that the outbreak happened right next to that lab. It is also just coincidence that the workers at that lab were sick way before anybody else was. And it is also assuredly just coincidence that a specific portion of this virus's genetic sequence happens to perfectly match a sequence patented years prior by a company that raked in cash as a result of it. Those are all just meaningless coincidences, but it is not just coincidence that some people got sick in the general proximity of some raccoon dogs. That is conclusive. That is definitive. That is all the news that's fit to print. And as we finally move on from what might be the greatest scandal of this generation, that is what we're supposed to believe. It was just the wrong raccoon dog, wrong time. Even if it sounds a lot more like wrong political and media power centers, wrong time. If you think those raccoon swabs are dirty, well, just wait until you try scrutinizing that CEO. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Gab. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.